Gentlemen, we're especially honored to have with us tonight a native son who has returned to Scranton after an illustrious career in the performing arts. Jason Miller is a native of West Scranton, attended St. Pat's grade school and high school, and attended the University of Scranton, and then went on to the drama department at the Catholic University of America. Jason is best known for, in the late 60s, as the author and Pulitzer Prize winner for the play That Championship Season. The play, in addition to winning the Pulitzer Prize, won the Tony Award as the best play of the year and the Drama Critics Circle Award. And it was only the second time in Broadway history that a play won the Triple Crown, so to speak. The only other play that did that was Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. Jason has also been an outstanding performer in films. He, as you will remember, played Father Karras in the movie The Exorcist and was nominated for an Academy Award in the category of Best Supporting Actor. He recently won an Emmy Award for a documentary entitled Mother of Courage, which was the story of Isaiah Thomas's mother. He has just concluded starring in a movie that was filmed, the better part of which was filmed, on the campus of the University of Notre Dame, in which he plays Ara Persegyan, and the title of the movie is Rudy. And that film will be released in September, I understand in September of 1993. Jason has a list of awards as long as your arm. And I had the privilege recently, my wife and I saw him play Barney Greenwald in Herman Wouk's prize-winning play, The Cane Mutiny Court-Martial, which was performed in the Lackawanna County Courthouse. And I can go back to July of 1954 and remember seeing the original play on Broadway with Henry Fonda and John Hodiak and Lloyd Nolan. And this production, in every sense, was comparable. And I would just take a brief moment of your time to say that Scranton Public Theater is just an enormous community resource and a great community asset. And I urge everyone to take every opportunity to see anything that they produce. They're doing just a wonderful job. Before calling upon Jason, I just would like to mention something I found in my old chest of drawers at home, a program from the 1964 Friendly Sons of St. Patrick dinner. And I'd just like to read something that appears in the program, and it's a quote from President John F. Kennedy. "We may be removed by 2 or 3 generations from Ireland, but yet when I ask how many have relatives in America, they all hold up their hands. Ireland has a special role. It is, in a sense, the mother of many peoples and many nations. I take great satisfaction and pride in being of Irish descent." These words were uttered by President Kennedy in June of 1963 when he was leaving Ireland to return home at Shannon Airport. I also would like to just mention something else in the program. There's a little quip under the identification of the president, who was Honorable William J. Nealon. And I think it's a very, very appropriate characterization 29 years later of Judge Nealon. And it reads, "And where'er he met a stranger, there he left a friend." Judge Nealon, I know I don't have to introduce Judge Nealon to everyone here, because he is not only well known, but he's a beloved member of this community. He's a senior judge. He was appointed to the federal bench by President John F. Kennedy in 1962. And I'm going to ask him to introduce Jason's recitation tonight of Robert Kennedy's speech. As president in 1964, he he can best describe the circumstances under which the speech took place. Judge Nealon.
Thank you, Don. With reference to Jason, I have to say this. When that championship season first was presented in New York, my wife and I went down in the, I don't know, maybe perhaps the second or third month. I must say, I think the stage play was far better than the movie, Jason, really. But I remember after being torn by the emotion of that particular play, thinking to myself how proud we should be in this area to think that a young fellow from West Scranton was able to put together a play that, as Don mentioned, not only earned him a Pulitzer Prize, but every conceivable award at that particular time for such a presentation. So we're very proud of him and very happy to have him tonight. Now, Don asked if I would kind of present the backdrop of what occurred here some 29 years ago when I was president of the Friendly Sons, and Bobby Kennedy honored us by making his first public appearance since the tragic assassination of his brother and his best friend, of course, President John F. Kennedy. In fact, it was less than 4 months after the assassination that he appeared here, and the memory becomes even more emotional when we remember that a little more than 4 years later, Bobby himself lost his life in a similar way to an assassin's bullet. But attending our dinner in 1964 with Bobby Kennedy was his administrative assistant and public relations representative, Edwin Guthman. And Mr. Guthman went on to national prominence himself and, among other things, became editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer. He was at the dinner in 1964, and he returned here as a guest in 1984, some 20 years later. And the next day, he penned an editorial in the Philadelphia Inquirer. It was entitled, "An Emerald Thread Spans the Generations in Scranton." And inasmuch as his words captured the flavor and the emotion of the Kennedy visit far better than I ever could, I would like to read some portions of that particular article as a prelude to Jason Miller's presentation. And it reads as follows. Dateline, Scranton. "So you were here with Bobby Kennedy in 1964, were you now?" the young man said, grabbing my hand. "I was too. I'll never forget it." I looked him over. Maybe 28 he was, or 30 at best. "Oh, you couldn't have been," I said. "You're not old enough." "I was only 9, he said, "but my father sneaked me in." Maybe his father did. There's hardly an Irishman in Scranton who'll admit that he wasn't in the old Hotel Casey on that raw March night when Kennedy gave one of the most heart-wringing speeches of his life. Not a one, anyway, did I meet at the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick dinner last night. And why should I have? It was a very special event. It was here on St. Patrick's Day, 1964, that Bobby Kennedy appeared before a large public gathering in the United States for the first time following President Kennedy's death. He went somewhat reluctantly, for through the crushing weeks after the assassination in Dallas, he had been desolate, holding his grief inwardly, functioning tautly, and wondering bleakly what he would do with his life. As spring approached, he began to perk up, but just below the surface, one often saw signs of a new somberness and fatalism, caused not only by the trauma of his brother's death, but also by the realization that any decision he would make about his future depended on events beyond his control. Scranton marked the turning point. When his plane arrived at the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre Airport on a gray afternoon, more than 2,000 people, most of them young, broke through police lines and crowded around him, jumping, shouting, laughing as they tried to touch him. so that he could not move from the bottom of the ramp until the police cleared a path. He was taken into Scranton to officiate at groundbreaking ceremonies for the new John F. Kennedy Elementary School. Heavy, wet snow had begun to fall, and along the route, about 10,000 men, women, and children huddled under the umbrellas to catch a glimpse of him. They were still lining the highway later when he drove into downtown Scranton. At the Hotel Casey, the crowd was so large and so exuberant that the hotel's heavy doors were torn from their hinges as people pressed forward to shake his hand. His appearance before the friendly sons of Lackawanna County was one of the most difficult he ever made. He had drafted a sentimental Irish speech, and he proposed to close with a poem about the death of the Irish patriot Owen Roe O'Neill, a poem written after O'Neill's death when Ireland was overwhelmed with grief. When I worked some changes he wanted into the speech, I eliminated the poem. When he read the redrafted test, he asked, "Why did you do that?" "Because you'll never get through it," I said. "I've been practicing in front of a mirror," he said. "I can't get through it yet, but I will." And in Scranton he did, just barely. But among the 1,300 stalwart sons of Erin, in that audience, many a grown man wept openly. Bobby Kennedy would never forget Scranton. On the plane back to Washington, astonished by the reception he had received, the poignant outpouring of love for President Kennedy, and so much evidence that he stood well with the people in his own right, that he made, at that time, an irrevocable decision about his future. Somehow, some way, he would remain in public service. With that, friendly sons, I now, if I may, introduce Jason Miller.
I am honored and I am delighted to be here with you tonight. Your dinner has become one of the most famous of the annual celebrations on this hallowed evening. I'm aware, of course, of the notable number of sons of St. Patrick who live here in Scranton. And as a son of St. Patrick myself, I know how friendly you've always been to President Kennedy in everything that he did, and to me whenever I've been here. So I think these things, in addition to the bonds of common kinship that the Irish everywhere feel on St. Patrick's Day, this is the day, you know, when legend has it that 3 requests were granted to St. Patrick by the angel of the Lord in order to bring happiness and hope to the Irish. First, that on this day, the weather should always be fair to allow the faithful to attend church. Second, that on every Thursday and Saturday, 12 Irish souls should be freed from the pains of hell. And third, that no outlander should ever rule over Ireland. Though I have not received the latest weather report from the Emerald Isle, I am confident that no rain fell there today, officially. Who pays heed to a little Irish mist? And I have reason to believe that the 12 Irishmen have been released from the nether regions as promised. Judge Nealon just told me he thinks that several of them are here tonight. And we need have no concern over the third promise. In Ireland, they are celebrating this day in freedom and in liberty. But you and I know that life was not always this good for the Irish, either back in the old country or here in America. There was, for example, that black day in February in 1847 when it was announced in the House of Commons that 15,000 people a day were dying of starvation in Ireland. And you may recall that Queen Victoria was so moved by this pitiful news that she contributed £5 to the Society for Irish Relief. So, the Irish left Ireland. Many of them came here to the United States. They left behind hearts and fields and a nation yearning to be free. It is no wonder that James Joyce described the Atlantic as a bowl of bitter tears. And an earlier poet wrote, "They are going, 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 and we cannot bid them stay." This country offered great advantages even then. But no one familiar with the story of the Irish here would underrate the difficulties they faced after landing in the United States. As the first of the racial minorities, our forefathers were subject to every discrimination found wherever discrimination is known. But many of them were gifted with a boundless confidence that served them well. One of these was a pugilist from my native Boston, John L. Sullivan, who won the heavyweight championship of the world. And not too many years after the flood tide of Irish immigration in this country. And in 1887, he toured the British Isles in triumph. Now, some idea of Irish progress can be gathered from his cordial greeting to the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. John L. said, "I'm proud to meet you. If you ever come to Boston, be sure to look me up. I'll see you're treated right." And referring to the prince, he later added with Irish generosity, "Anyone can see he's a gentleman. He's the kind of a man you'd like to introduce to your family." But it was less than 9 months ago when President Kennedy, in touring Ireland, used to ask the crowds he talked to how many had cousins in America. The usual response was for nearly every hand in the crowd to be raised, and it was with great delight he was able to say, "I've seen them, and they're doing well." And so, it is my great delight to be with you here tonight as we take a few moments to share the rich heritage of the Irish. It's worth noting, I think, that all the wealth of our legacy stems from a small island in the far Atlantic with a population 1/4 the size of the state of Pennsylvania. The Irish have survived persecution in their own land and discrimination in ours. They have emerged from the shadow of subjugation into the sunlight of personal liberty and national independence. And they have shared the struggles for freedom of more than a score of nations across this entire globe. Irish soldiers are now en route tonight to help preserve the peace in Cyprus. Indeed, Ireland's chief export has not been potatoes nor linen, but exiles and immigrants who have fought with sword and pen for freedom around the earth. We need but recall the heroic deeds of the wild geese, the officers and soldiers forced to flee their native Ireland after the Battle of the Boyne. Fighting for the French, they broke the ranks of the English at Fontenoy. Fighting for the Spanish, they turned the tide of battle against the Germans at Milazzo. And other Irishmen in other years, going into battle with the Union Army, a green sprig in their hats, bore the brunt of the hopeless assaults on the Confederate heights at Fredericksburg. 1,200 soldiers of the Irish Brigade went into action that bitterly cold December day in 1862. Only 280 survived. As President Kennedy noted last summer when he presented the brigade's battle-torn flag to the Irish people, never were men so brave. And of themselves, the Irish soldiers said, war-battered dogs are we, gnawing a naked bone, fighters in every land and clime, for every cause but our own. So the first point I'd like to make arises from the traditional Irish concern for freedom everywhere. I know of few in our land, and I hope none in this room, who would ignore threats to peace and freedom in far-off places. No problem weighs heavier on the consciousness of free men than the fate of millions held in iron captivity. But what is taking place on the other side of the Iron Curtain should not only be a matter of concern to us who are committed to freedom. I would hope that none here would ignore the current struggle of some of our fellow citizens right here in the United States for the measure of their freedom. In considering this, it may be helpful for us to recall some of the conditions that existed in Ireland from 1691 until well into the 19th century, against which our forefathers fought. We might remember, for instance, that in Ireland of 1691, no Irish Catholic could vote, serve on a jury, enter a university, become a lawyer, work for the government, or marry a Protestant. And our pride in the progress of the Irish is chilled by the tragic irony that it has not been progress for everyone. We know that it has not been progress for humanity. I know because so much work of the Department of Justice today is devoted to securing these or compatible rights for all Americans in the United States in 1964. There are Americans who, as the Irish did, still face discrimination in employment, sometimes open, sometimes hidden. There are cities in America today that are torn with strife over whether a Negro should be allowed to drive a garbage truck. And there are walls of silent conspiracy that block the progress of others because of race, of creed, without regard to ability. It is toward concern for these issues and vigorous participation on the side of freedom that our Irish heritage must impel us. If we are true to this heritage, we cannot stand aside. There are two other areas of concern which I feel are of personal importance and to which the Irish tradition speaks in ringing tones. One is the status of freedom in colonies, and second, our relationship to the underdeveloped nations of the world. The greatest enemy of freedom today, of course, is communism, a tyranny that holds its captives in a vice-like subjugation on a global scale. For nearly 20 years, we and our allies have striven to halt the communist advance. But one of the weaknesses in our common front has been the restraint of freedom sponsored by our allies and accepted by ourselves. The conduct of our foreign affairs should be consistently based on our recognition of every man's right to be economically and politically free. This is the American tradition. We were, after all, the victor in our own war for independence. We promulgated the Monroe Doctrine and the open door policy with their clear warnings to the colonial powers of Europe. We gave self-determination to our own dependencies, and for more than a century, we opposed colonial exploitation elsewhere. But throughout all this, we were still largely living in splendid isolation, removed from a direct control of world destiny. All this was changed by World War II. The frontiers of our national security became the frontiers of the world. We found ourselves obliged to deal with the harsh facts of existence on a global basis. For the sake of our own security, we found our destiny to be closely linked with that of nations that maintained large colonial empires on which they felt their ultimate security depended. In some of the underdeveloped countries, we have found our destiny linked with ruling powers or classes which hold the vast majority of their people in economic and military subjugation. Now, it is easy for us to believe that the imperialism of the West was infinitely preferable to the tyranny of communism. But the sullen hostility of the African and the Asian colonial nations have shown us that this does not hold true. The bloody struggles for liberty, from the sands of Algeria to the steaming jungles of Indochina and Vietnam, prove that others would make the same sacrifice to throw off the yoke of imperialism today that the Irish did more than a half a century ago. I like to think, as President Kennedy did, that the emerald thread runs into the cloth that we weave today. That these policies in which he believed so strongly and which President Johnson is advancing are the current flowering of the Irish tradition. They are directed toward freedom for all Americans here and for all peoples throughout the world. And I like to think that these policies will survive and continue as the cause of Irish freedom survived the death of the liberator, Owen Roe McNeill. As you recall, O'Neill was one of the great figures of Irish history. It was a period after his death when the entire Irish nation was overwhelmed with grief that the following lines were written. Sagest in the council was he, kindest in the hall. Sure, we never won a battle. 'Twas Owen that won them all. Soft as woman was your voice, O'Neill. Bright was your eye. Why did you leave us, Owen? Why did you die? Your troubles are all over. You're at rest with God on high, but we are slaves and we are orphans, Owen. Why did you die? We're sheep without a shepherd. When the snow shuts out the sky, why did you leave us, Owen? Why did you die? So, on this St. Patrick's evening, let me urge you one final time to recall the heritage of the Irish. Let us hold out our hands to those who struggle for freedom today, at home and abroad, as Ireland struggled for thousands of years. Let us not leave them to be sheep without a shepherd when the snow shuts out the sky. Let us show them that we have not forgotten the constancy and the faith and the hope of the Irish. Thank you.
In behalf of the membership of the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, and with my own personal deep feelings, I would like to thank you very much, Jason, for being with us tonight and sharing that speech with us. Those of us who were present on that night in 1964, we still bore the grief of President Kennedy's death, and it brings back some very poignant memories, and thank you so much for being with us. And Judge Nealon, thank you too for your role tonight in presenting the backdrop to this memorable speech. I think now, in an effort to strike a brighter note, I'm going to call upon John Starr Kelly, who has composed a special song that, and I think you're going to enjoy this. Starr sang this to me over the telephone, and I really am so fond of Starr, and the thing that strikes me is that the closer we get to St. Patrick's Day, the sweeter is his brogue, I think.
Thank you, Don. Now, this song is composed for you gentlemen. It's entitled, If It Weren't for the Irish. If it weren't for the Irish, there never would be friendly sons of St. Patrick, Lackawanna County. There'd be no President Donald Nolan with his gavel. He'd be spending all his time at venture travel. There'd be no Holy Cross alumni discussing former classes, and no Dr. William Jordan prescribing your eyeglasses. If it weren't for the Irish, would Harrisburg ever see Governor Robert Casey or Jimmy Haggerty? There'd be no Dr. Corcoran concerned about the menu, and no Frank McDonald wondering where to seat you. There'd be no Thomas Cummings with his beguiling smile. Jimmy Howley has one too, like Dr. Quinn and Billy Prile. If it weren't for the Irish, where would our judicial system be? We've got Judges Egan, Conley Walsh, Munley Walsh, and Carlin O'Malley. and the bad guys of the area have been sent reeling, thanks to the diligence of Judges Conaboy and Nealon. And there'd be no Joseph Corcoran in the courthouse every day. Joseph Corcoran might be governor if Gene Cosgrove has his way. If it weren't for the Irish, there would be no Scranton Times, with Eddie, George, and Billy checking all the lines. There'd be no columnist Ray Flanagan having his say, and no editor Robert Burke getting his way. There would be no David Harding adjusting all our claims, and no Dr. Thomas Coleman to cure our aches and pains. If it weren't for the Irish, would there be a good cigar? Robert Keating makes parodies, and they're the best by far. There'd be no banker John Keeler at Fidelity, and no Ken McGraw with his brass and ivory. There'd be no Monsignor McGowan to entertain us as we dine. Each year he gets new material, and that suits us just fine. And in closing, let me say, I'm proud to be a friendly son, and to be with you this evening as we have a lot of fun.
By popular demand, the audience was crying encore, encore. So, in response to that, Stars agreed to do one more number.
This is your invitation to our annual parade in downtown Scranton. Come to downtown Scranton just to see the big parade. It's the Saturday before St. Patrick's Day. Bring the wife and kiddies and your uncles and aunts too. The Iram Temple Shriners will put on a show for you. Our President John R. Williams will lead a big brass band, and our friends the Penn York Highlanders will also be on hand. Of course you're going to see your favorite local high school band on the Saturday before St. Patrick's Day in downtown Scranton, on the Saturday before St. Patrick's Day.
Always entertaining, Star. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, that concludes now the official entertainment. We're going to have music for the remainder of the evening, and the bar is open. And I would remind you again that ticket sales will take place up here. Dues collections, anybody that hasn't paid. And any questions, any of those two gentlemen who were nominated from the floor or who wanted to be nominated, kindly come up and make sure we have the correct address. And one final announcement. Anybody that is here tonight for reasons other than having received a card in the mail, if you came here because someone told you to come, or a parent or whatever, and you wish to give us your correct address, if you're a member of the advisory committee, the executive committee, we would appreciate up-to-date addresses, because our mailing list is constantly being updated. So anybody that feels they want to update their address, please do so. Is there anything else? Okay, that does it. And enjoy yourself and enjoy yourselves this evening, and enjoy the music of Ken McGraw. Thank you.